Have you heard of Lavrentiy Beria, the man who controlled terror in the Soviet Union and came closer than anyone to succeeding Joseph Stalin as the absolute ruler of one of the world's superpowers? This comprehensive and deeply detailed examination will reveal who the shadow boss of the regime truly was, exposing carefully guarded secrets, sophisticated strategies of manipulation, and the brutal, methodical ascent of one of the most feared, influential and consequential figures of the 20th century. Understanding Beria's trajectory is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity or academic interest, but rather a necessary and urgent study in the mechanics of authoritarian power, the psychological architecture of totalitarian control, and the systematic methods by which individuals can subvert institutional structures to concentrate extraordinary power in their own hands. Here you will discover in unprecedented detail how Beria manipulated power from behind the scenes with extraordinary sophistication and calculated precision, what his true ambitions were beyond mere survival in Stalin's court, and why his name became synonymous with fear, absolute control, systematic oppression, and the industrialization of state terror. This examination goes far beyond superficial historical narratives and popular simplifications, helping you understand how such leaders are capable of shaping entire countries, influencing the course of geopolitical events for generations, restructuring social institutions to serve authoritarian purposes, and what crucial lessons we can extract to identify signs of emerging authoritarianism in contemporary society across different political systems and cultural contexts. The mechanisms Beria employed to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and institutionalize surveillance remain disturbingly relevant in understanding modern surveillance states. The concentration of political authority in nominally democratic systems and the erosion of civil liberties that occurs gradually under the justification of security necessities. Have you ever seriously contemplated how far a person can go to conquer and maintain power at any cost, sacrificing moral principles and human lives without hesitation, or how such dangerous and morally compromised figures managed to stay in control for extended periods, surviving political turbulence that destroyed countless others who seemed equally powerful and well-positioned? Stay with me through this extensive exploration, because the story of Beria can fundamentally help you see the present with different eyes, providing a robust, analytical framework for understanding the warning signs that precede the erosion of democratic institutions, the rise of authoritarian governance structures, and the concentration of power that undermines accountability and the rule of law. Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria was born on March 29, 1899, in the small rural village of Merkulye in western Georgia, an isolated community in a region then part of the vast Russian Empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. He was the son of impoverished Mingrelian peasants, an ethnic minority from the Caucasus, known for their strong family traditions, intense regional loyalty, distinct cultural identity within the broader Georgian population, and a language that differed significantly from Standard Georgian. The local social structure in late imperial Russia imposed clear and rigid limits on social mobility, with peasant families rarely transcending their predetermined economic status or escaping the poverty that had characterized their existence for generations. However, despite these formidable obstacles, Beria demonstrated early and notable intellectual aptitude that distinguished him from his peers, and he managed through a combination of ability and fortunate circumstances to enter primary school in Sukhumi, the capital of Abkhazia, where he gained access to basic technical education that was uncommon and often unavailable for children of his background and social class. The educational opportunity Beria received represented a significant and consequential departure from the expected trajectory of rural Georgian children at the turn of the 20th century, when literacy rates among peasants remained extremely low, and formal education was largely restricted to urban populations and the privileged classes. His family, though materially poor and lacking connections to local authorities, recognized his intellectual potential early and made considerable sacrifices to ensure his continued education, foregoing his labor in the fields and spending scarce resources on his schooling. This early investment in his education would prove consequential far beyond what his parents could have imagined, as it provided Beria with literacy in multiple languages, numerical and analytical skills, exposure to Russian language and culture that positioned him advantageously for later advancement within Russian and Soviet institutions, and an understanding of technical subjects that would prove valuable throughout his career. In 1915, at the age of 16, and with ambitions already exceeding his rural origins, he enrolled at the Baku Technical School, located in a strategic and economically vital city on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Baku was famous not only for its substantial oil production, which made it one of the most economically important cities in the Russian Empire and attracted international investment, but also as a constant focus of political conflict, ethnic tension between competing national groups, revolutionary activity, and labor unrest among the multinational workforce employed in the petroleum industry. The institution received students from different ethnicities and socio-economic backgrounds, which generated an atmosphere of permanent tension among Armenian nationalists who sought autonomy or independence, Azerbaijani populations asserting their own cultural identity, Russian socialists promoting revolution, and various other political factions. This multicultural environment exposed Beria to the complex ethnic dynamics, competing national movements, and ideological conflicts that would later inform his approach to managing diverse populations under Soviet rule, and his understanding of how ethnic tensions could be manipulated for political purposes. Beria graduated successfully with a specialization in mechanical engineering, with particular emphasis on civil construction, infrastructure development, and industrial applications. His technical education was rigorous, demanding, and practical, designed to produce competent engineers capable of supporting the empire's modernization efforts and industrial expansion. Although he focused primarily on his technical studies and maintained good academic standing, he also participated strategically in student groups that debated political issues informally, carefully observing the ideological currents, assessing which factions were gaining influence, and evaluating potential future trajectories without committing himself publicly to any particular faction or risking identification with positions that might later prove dangerous. This cautious, calculating approach to politics would become a defining hallmark of his entire career, allowing him to navigate extremely dangerous political environments while others fell victim to their own public declarations, ideological commitments, and inability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Among his professors were Russian experts, foreign specialists brought from Western Europe, and technical authorities recruited by the Tsarist state to promote technical development in the Transcaucasian region, an area considered strategically vital for economic development, but significantly underdeveloped compared to Central Russia. Beria had access to scientific literature in French, Russian, and German, which allowed him to develop linguistic fluency that would later prove invaluable in his work as an intelligence agent, in managing relationships with foreign specialists during the Soviet nuclear program, in reading technical documents from Western sources, and in conducting interrogations of foreign prisoners and suspects. His multilingual abilities set him distinctly apart from many of his contemporaries who remained limited to Russian, and provided him with access to international technical knowledge, scientific developments, and political analyses that remained completely inaccessible to monolingual colleagues. Despite his technical training and focus on academic advancement, he deliberately avoided participating in public demonstrations, stayed carefully away from strikes or student protests, even when they addressed legitimate grievances, and maintained a low political profile, even when some of his classmates were arrested for subversive activities and faced severe punishment. This strategic restraint demonstrated an early and sophisticated understanding of risk management, political survival, and the importance of not attracting negative attention from authorities. While other students engaged in passionate but extremely dangerous political activism that often led to arrest, exile, or execution, Beria calculated with cold rationality that his path to influence and power lay not in revolutionary martyrdom or ideological purity, but in acquiring practical skills valued by authorities, building networks within existing power structures, and positioning himself to be useful regardless of which political faction ultimately prevailed. Unlike many young people in the region who opted for a more open ideological commitment and public displays of revolutionary fervor that won them recognition among peers, Beria preferred to focus systematically on acquiring useful skills for the state apparatus, including structural calculation, technical drawing, industrial organization, administrative management, and the practical knowledge necessary for large-scale projects. He understood intuitively and demonstrated through his actions that technical competence would be valued regardless of which political faction ultimately prevailed in the revolutionary struggles, and that specialists would always be needed even as politicians were purged. He also maintained carefully cultivated contact with local officials of the Okhrana, the secret police of the Tsarist regime responsible for suppressing revolutionary activity, which demonstrates his remarkably early interest in understanding control mechanisms, surveillance techniques, methods of infiltration, and the exercise of state power long before officially entering politics or joining revolutionary organizations. These early connections provided him with valuable insight into the operational methods of security services, the importance of information control, and techniques that he would later refine, systematize, and apply on a vastly larger scale. In 1917, with the dramatic fall of Tsarism following military defeats and popular unrest, and the rapid rise of the Soviets claiming to represent workers and soldiers, Beria joined the Bolshevik Party in Baku, where he already maintained carefully developed links with local workers, cells, underground revolutionary organizations, and networks of activists. The context was one of civil war that would claim millions of lives, complete institutional collapse, foreign intervention by multiple powers, and ethnic fragmentation in the southern Caucasus, which favored the recruitment of agents willing to act with autonomy, decisiveness, and the harshness necessary to impose order through violence. The chaos of revolution, the breakdown of traditional authority, and the fluidity of power relationships created unprecedented opportunities for ambitious individuals who could demonstrate loyalty to the new regime and effectiveness in suppressing opposition. Beria was assigned as a technician and informant in the background of the Bolshevik struggle against Armenian forces, Menshevik socialists who opposed Bolshevik methods, Muslim nationalists seeking independence, and various other anti-Bolshevik factions. His technical background made him valuable for tasks requiring organizational skills, systematic thinking, and the ability to manage logistics, while his ethnic Georgian identity gave him credibility in local contexts and access to networks that would have been closed to Russian Bolsheviks. In 1919, he was officially incorporated as a Cheka agent in Azerbaijan when the Bolsheviks took control of Baku with the military support of the Red Army and proceeded to consolidate their authority through force. He participated actively in the repression of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, which was dissolved by military force and its leadership arrested or executed, and collaborated in operations to detain nationalist leaders, members of the local intelligentsia who opposed Bolshevik rule, religious figures with traditional authority, and merchant classes considered politically unreliable. The Cheka, the newly formed secret police, used him as a regional intelligence coordinator with significant autonomy, with functions that included conducting interrogations using physical and psychological pressure, preparation of detailed lists of suspects for arrest or execution, infiltration of civilian groups to gather intelligence, and compilation of intelligence reports for higher authorities that influenced policy decisions. The apparatus was still in its formative stages, with improvised procedures, unclear chains of command, and agents learning through trial and error, and Beria operated in areas with high armed resistance such as Ganja and Lankaran, where violence was routine. Life expectancy for Cheka agents was extremely limited, and survival required both ruthlessness and intelligence. In 1920, he was transferred to Georgia, where Menshevik resistance was more intense, better organized, and ideologically sophisticated, especially in mountainous and rural areas where Bolshevik authority remained contested and traditional social structures remained intact. Operating in Tiflis, the Georgian capital, he joined the local Cheka in missions to systematically repress the press through closures and arrests, confiscate properties from political opponents and the wealthy classes, eliminate remnants of the overthrown Menshevik government that had briefly ruled independent Georgia, and dismantle opposition networks that continued operating underground. He also supervised the creation of comprehensive archives on the Georgian elite, documenting their associations, political histories, family connections, financial resources, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited for blackmail or manipulation. This practice of systematic documentation, meticulous record-keeping, and the creation of dossiers would later be applied on a vastly larger scale as a fundamental model of information control and as an essential tool for blackmail, intimidation, and the manipulation of individuals throughout the Soviet system. The trust that Beria generated among his superiors in the Cheka and later in the OGPU was due far less to his ideological commitment, revolutionary credentials, or expressions of loyalty than to his consistent operational efficiency, his ability to deliver results on time, and his production of concrete outcomes that could be quantified and reported upward through the bureaucracy. He delivered measurable outcomes that impressed superiors, number of arrests that could be tabulated, dismantling of opposition organizations that could be documented, collection of actionable strategic information that led to further operations, and successful completion of assigned missions without complications or failures. In 1921, he was promoted within the expanding Cheka structure and received supervisory tasks in areas such as Kutaisi and Batumi, where Georgian armed resistance remained active, well supplied, and capable of conducting effective operations against Soviet forces. He employed a range of methods, including selective kidnappings of opposition leaders and their families, sophisticated blackmail of dissidents, families using threats against children and relatives, infiltration of undercover spies in unions and agricultural cooperatives, the cultivation of informant networks that extended into previously inaccessible social circles, and the systematic use of violence to intimidate populations. In 1924, marking a significant advancement in his career, Lavrentiy Beria was appointed head of the OGPU for the Transcaucasian region, a strategic area of critical importance that comprised Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The position gave him substantial control over intelligence operations, political repression, state security, counterintelligence activities, and surveillance of potentially disloyal populations in one of the most ethnically diverse, politically complex, and strategically sensitive regions of the Soviet Union. His main task was to stabilize the area against armed uprisings by peasants resisting collectivization, nationalists who rejected Soviet rule, religious groups opposing atheist policies, and remnants of previous political movements who resisted the process of forced Sovietization. Upon assuming the position with characteristic energy, he organized a substantial corps of local agents, many of them recruited from students needing employment, workers seeking advancement, unemployed youth who needed income, and individuals willing to inform on their neighbors, family members, and colleagues to act as informants and infiltrators throughout society. Transcaucasia represented a particular and formidable challenge for Moscow because of ongoing territorial disputes among different ethnic groups with conflicting historical claims, persistent influence from foreign powers, including Turkey and Persia, who maintained cultural and economic ties, the legacy of nationalist parties that had briefly governed during the period of independence, and populations with strong traditions of resistance to outside authority. Beria responded systematically by expanding home surveillance dramatically, installing listening posts and observation points in major urban centers such as Tiflis, Yerevan, and Baku, and creating a comprehensive system for monitoring communications, intercepting mail, and tracking the movements of suspects. He also introduced innovative methods of reporting coding to prevent compromising information from being intercepted, standardized forms for anonymous denunciations that encouraged citizens to report on each other, bureaucratic procedures for processing intelligence that allowed for systematic analysis, and hierarchical reporting structures that professionalized the flow of information to Moscow, ensured accountability of agents, and allowed for systematic analysis of potential threats to Soviet authority. During that critical period of consolidation, Beria strengthened the centralization of Soviet power in the Southern Caucasus by methodically dissolving informal networks of authority that competed with state control and provided alternative sources of legitimacy. These included religious councils that commanded traditional respect, merchant guilds that controlled economic resources, traditional tribal structures with deep historical roots, and local militias that provided security independent of state forces. He led specific targeted campaigns against former combatants of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, who retained military skills and organizational capacity, confiscating their properties, imposing constant surveillance on their descendants to prevent the emergence of new resistance, and systematically eliminating any possibility of organized opposition through preemptive arrests and executions. In rural areas where traditional authority remained strong, he promoted the expulsion of influential community leaders who commanded respect and loyalty, and replaced them with cadres loyal to the party who depended entirely on Soviet authority for their positions, creating a new elite beholden to the regime. The OGPU under Beria's command also carried out internal purges within the regional Communist Party itself, demonstrating his sophisticated understanding that threats to Soviet power could emerge even within the party apparatus from those with local loyalties or ideological deviations. Those members considered ideologically ambiguous, insufficiently zealous in implementing directives, suspected of harboring nationalist sentiments or displaying tendencies toward autonomy, were systematically accused of counter-revolutionary deviations. These accusations were generally based on evidence gathered through wiretaps, intercepted correspondence, testimony from informants seeking to settle personal scores, or forced confessions obtained through extended physical and psychological pressure, including torture. Between 1926 and 1929, dozens of mid-level cadres were dismissed from their positions, arrested and interrogated, or executed under his direct supervision after perfunctory trials, creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear that discouraged any form of dissent, encouraged conformity to directives from Moscow, and established the principle that even party membership provided no protection from repression. In 1931, marking another crucial advancement in his accumulation of power, Lavrentiy Beria was appointed first secretary of the Communist Party of Georgia, a position that made him the supreme political authority of the Republic and granted him unprecedented power over virtually all aspects of Georgian society. That position was equivalent to total control of the local state apparatus, with comprehensive supervision over the economy, security forces, cultural institutions, educational systems, media organizations, and enforcement of ideological conformity. During that period, the Soviet Union under Stalin's increasingly dictatorial rule was promoting aggressive agricultural collectivization and forced industrialization under ambitious 5-year plans, directives that Beria implemented with notable technical rigor, bureaucratic efficiency, and calculated repression designed to overcome resistance. He ordered the forced conversion of private rural properties into collective farms called kolkhozes, reorganized railway routes to facilitate industrial development and resource extraction, and established demanding agricultural production quotas under threat of severe punishment for failure to meet targets, including arrest for sabotage. Beria responded to inevitable resistance from peasants and traditional communities with coordinated repressive measures, combining forced expulsions from ancestral lands, administrative detentions without trial or formal charges, propaganda campaigns that demonized resistors as enemies of progress, and occasional public executions designed to intimidate the broader population into compliance. He created local tribunals with revolutionary legitimacy to expedite trials for economic sabotage and resistance to collectivization, with proceedings based primarily on confessions obtained under physical torture, extended sleep deprivation, threats against family members including children, and other forms of psychological pressure that broke the will of accused individuals. In the first 2 years of his administration alone, more than 100,000 people were directly affected by internal deportations to remote regions, exile to labor camps, imprisonment in overcrowded facilities, or execution, mainly families classified as kulaks based on arbitrary criteria, bourgeois remnants suspected of opposing Soviet power, or silent counter-revolutionaries whose mere existence and traditional way of life threatened the new social order. In the industrial sphere, demonstrating his technical competence, Beria directed substantial resources toward the construction of hydroelectric plants that would power industrial development, textile factories that employed thousands of workers, metallurgical plants that produced steel for construction and military purposes, and infrastructure projects that fundamentally transformed Georgia's economic base from agricultural to industrial. He encouraged and sometimes mandated the importation of technicians, engineers and skilled workers from other Soviet republics, which reduced local autonomy and diluted Georgian ethnic dominance in industry, but significantly accelerated the execution timelines of ambitious projects that would have been impossible using only local expertise. The urban infrastructure of Tiflis was comprehensively redesigned to house growing industrial centers, collective housing for workers who had migrated from rural areas, administrative buildings for the expanding bureaucracy, and extensive facilities for security services that monitored the population. Under his leadership, which combined brutal repression with genuine economic development, the Georgian capital experienced notable economic growth, measurable increases in industrial output that impressed Moscow, and visible modernization of infrastructure. Although these material achievements came at the enormous cost of profound human suffering, traumatic social dislocation, and the violent destruction of traditional ways of life that had existed for centuries. While promoting forced modernization and celebrating industrial achievements in public speeches and reports to Moscow, Beria simultaneously exercised strict and comprehensive control over cultural production and intellectual life throughout Georgia. Writers, journalists, poets, university professors, artists, musicians, and other cultural figures were subjected to ideological reviews by party committees, mandatory self-criticism sessions where they confessed ideological errors, and silent purges that removed those deemed unreliable or insufficiently committed to Soviet principles without public announcement. Artistic projects that emphasized Georgian national identity, celebrated pre-Soviet history, referenced Georgia's brief period of independence, or suggested any form of cultural distinctiveness separate from Soviet identity were systematically cancelled or substantially rewritten to conform to the restrictive guidelines of socialist realism and Soviet internationalism. He also personally coordinated the physical elimination of prominent public figures linked to Georgia's independent past, literary figures who had celebrated Georgian culture and history, intellectuals whose writings could potentially inspire nationalist sentiment among the population, and former political leaders who retained prestige, often under fabricated charges of espionage for foreign powers or conspiracy to overthrow Soviet rule. In August 1938, marking the beginning of his rise to supreme power within the Soviet security apparatus, Lavrentiy Beria was summoned to Moscow by Stalin himself to assume the position of Deputy People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, which was equivalent to the deputy directorship of the NKVD, the powerful and universally feared secret police of the Soviet Union. His appointment coincided precisely with the final phase of the Great Purge, which until then had been conducted with increasing chaos by Nikolai Yezhov, whose management had plunged the country into a destructive spiral of arbitrary arrests, mass executions, and institutional chaos that threatened the stability of the Soviet state itself and was beginning to negatively affect economic production. Stalin chose Beria as an alternative to the growing instability that the purge itself was generating, recognizing that the terror, while politically useful, had become counterproductive and required more systematic management by someone with proven organizational abilities. At that critical time, the NKVD was a terror machine on the verge of organizational collapse and institutional breakdown. The population lived under constant fear of midnight arrests without warning. The prison system was completely saturated with detainees awaiting processing, and the massive apparatus of repression was consuming resources, personnel, and administrative capacity at an unsustainable rate that was interfering with other state functions. Beria found the institution profoundly disorganized, with an excess of agents operating without centralized control or coordination, imprecise administrative records that made coherent policy implementation impossible, and competing fiefdoms within the bureaucracy. where different factions pursued their own agendas. As a first significant measure demonstrating his systematic approach, he ordered a comprehensive audit of the files of ongoing repressive operations, suspended scheduled executions pending review of their justification, and began to systematically review orders for mass arrests to determine which had legitimate security justifications and which were simply products of bureaucratic momentum or personal vendettas. Beria initiated the methodical replacement of cadres within the NKVD, especially in the regions with the highest number of sentences without formal trial or adequate documentation, removing those associated with Yezhov or whose competence he questioned. He promoted technical training for new agents, emphasizing intelligence gathering and the production of actionable information over arbitrary violence and unproductive terror, and created standardized interrogation systems with approved methods, documentation requirements, and oversight mechanisms, centralizing decisions in internal committees that reported directly to him and reducing the autonomy of regional officers. He also promoted the comprehensive review of denunciation protocols to reduce obviously false accusations that wasted resources and systematically removed former close collaborators of Yezhov who were considered incompetent, excessively fanatical, potentially disloyal to the new leadership or who possessed too much knowledge of previous crimes. His actions during this transition also included the systematic collection of incriminating material against Yezhov himself, building a detailed case that would justify his removal and ultimate execution. Yezhov would be arrested in April 1939 after being progressively stripped of his positions, isolated from his supporters, and subjected to a campaign of character assassination. The accusations included abuse of power for personal gain, administrative disorganization and incompetence, deviation from party directives, conspiracy with foreign powers, and treason. Although these charges were clearly motivated by political interests and the need for a scapegoat, rather than objective assessment of his conduct relative to prevailing standards, Beria personally supervised part of the investigation, interviewed witnesses and former colleagues, reviewed documents, and prepared detailed reports for Stalin that reinforced the narrative of Yezhov as a threat to Soviet stability. An enemy who had infiltrated the security services and emphasized the urgent need to eliminate the former security chief to restore order and rational administration. In November 1938, consolidating his control over the most powerful instrument of Soviet state power, Lavrentiy Beria was officially appointed People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, assuming total control of the NKVD after the fall and subsequent execution of Nikolai Yezhov, who was shot as an enemy of the people. This transition marked the formal end of the most chaotic and destructive stage of the Great Purge, although it emphatically did not signify the abandonment of repression, a softening of Soviet authoritarianism, or any genuine liberalization of the political system. Beria did not dismantle the Soviet terror machine or reduce its capacity for violence, surveillance, or the suppression of dissent. He simply reorganized it systematically to function more efficiently, with clearer objectives, better documentation, superior coordination, and strategic targeting rather than the indiscriminate mass killing that had characterized Yezhov's tenure. He revoked orders for mass executions still pending that lacked clear justification or supporting documentation, but kept the fundamental structure of prisons and forced labor camps completely intact and functioning at full capacity with hundreds of thousands of inmates. One of his immediate priorities upon assuming control was the comprehensive reorganization of the gulags, redesigning them not merely as punishment facilities or detention centers, but as productive arms of the Soviet economy that could make substantial contributions to industrial development and infrastructure construction. The camps began to be systematically used in major infrastructure works, requiring massive labor inputs, such as railroads connecting remote regions to industrial centers, mines extracting valuable resources, including gold and uranium, and dams providing hydroelectric power for industrial development, especially in remote and inhospitable areas of Siberia and the Far East, where free labor could not be attracted under any conditions. Beria created specific divisions within the NKVD to manage civil engineering projects, oversee construction logistics, coordinate the supply of materials, and ensure that production targets were met, effectively transforming prisoners into a permanent state labor force that could be deployed anywhere without regard for workers' safety, survival rates, or humane conditions. The exploitation of forced labor was formalized through comprehensive economic plans with specific production targets, supervised by professional engineers accountable for results, economic planners integrating gulag output into broader industrial plans, and security chiefs who faced consequences for failing to meet quotas or allowing escapes. The gulag system under Beria became increasingly rationalized, with prisoners systematically categorized by skill level and physical condition, work assignments based on physical capacity and technical knowledge, and systematic extraction of maximum labor before death or complete incapacitation. The human cost was enormous and deliberately ignored, with mortality rates in certain camps and projects reaching catastrophic levels that approached or exceeded 50% annually. But from the perspective of Soviet economic planning and cost-benefit analysis, the system proved effective and economically rational in completing massive projects that would have been economically unfeasible using compensated labor with normal working conditions. In addition to gulag reform and economic exploitation of prisoners, Beria substantially strengthened the areas of counterintelligence and economic surveillance within the NKVD. Recognizing that external threats from foreign intelligence services and internal sabotage posed ongoing dangers to Soviet security that required constant vigilance, he founded specialized departments focused on detecting and preventing industrial sabotage, control of scientists who might defect or share secrets with foreign powers, and intensive monitoring of foreign technicians present in Soviet territory who had access to sensitive information and might be intelligence agents. He implemented systematic internal audits in factories and strategic installations, often based on anonymous denunciations that were investigated thoroughly, statistical anomalies that suggested theft or inefficiency, or manipulated data that could justify intervention and the replacement of management. In the political sphere, demonstrating his understanding that information was power, Beria used his position to closely monitor regional leaders, including party members who had survived earlier purges and might pose future challenges to central authority or to his own position. Surveillance over his own allies and supposed comrades became routine, implemented through telephone interceptions that recorded all conversations, hidden microphones installed in offices and private residences by specialized technical teams, infiltrated agents placed among their staff who reported on private conversations, and systematic analysis of internal correspondence. He also resumed control of secret files on historical leaders of the revolution, who still retained prestige and influence among older party members, thereby reinforcing his blackmail power within the state structure and ensuring that even senior officials with long revolutionary credentials remained vulnerable to exposure of past errors or compromising associations. With the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, which caught Soviet forces unprepared despite intelligence warnings, Beria assumed dramatically expanded functions within the state apparatus, concentrating unprecedented powers related to internal security, military logistics, industrial mobilization for war production, and forced population transfers. The war demanded not only defense against external military threats from the most powerful military force in Europe, but also strict surveillance over the civilian population for signs of defeatism. Ethnic minorities suspected of potential disloyalty to the Soviet state, border regions vulnerable to enemy influence and infiltration, and returning soldiers who might have been compromised through capture or exposure to enemy propaganda. The NKVD became the primary instrument of preventive repression during the war, responsible for identifying and neutralizing possible collaborators with the enemy, deserters who abandoned their military units, and socially dangerous elements whose loyalty seemed questionable under the extreme pressures of total war. Between 1943 and 1944, as Soviet forces advanced westward and recovered territories that had been under German occupation, Beria coordinated one of the most brutal ethnic cleansing campaigns of the Stalinist era, implementing the systematic mass deportation of entire peoples considered collectively suspicious of collaborating with the enemy based primarily on ethnic identity rather than individual actions or evidence of actual collaboration. Communities such as the Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Balkars, Kalmyks, Karaches, and others were systematically expelled from their ancestral regions of origin in lightning military operations carried out by NKVD troops with logistical support from the Red Army. Thousands died during transport in sealed railway wagons without adequate ventilation, without access to adequate food, water, or medical care, and without sanitation facilities, bound for inhospitable regions of Central Asia and Siberia where they would remain in permanent exile, forbidden to return to their homelands. The deportations were organized according to geographic and ethnic criteria, based on comprehensive lists prepared by local commissions that identified targets and personally reviewed and approved by Beria himself, who took direct responsibility for the operations. In the vast majority of cases, there was no concrete evidence of actual collaboration with German forces or any judicial process to determine individual guilt. It was sufficient to belong to a group catalogued as suspect, defined purely by ethnicity, to warrant immediate deportation of entire families, including elderly persons and young children. The process was planned with military precision and bureaucratic thoroughness that reflected Beria's engineering background. The convoys were escorted by heavily armed NKVD battalions, and every movement was timed, documented, and coordinated to prevent escapes, uprisings, or unauthorized interventions by sympathetic Soviet officials. Simultaneously, properties, livestock, agricultural equipment, and possessions confiscated from these populations were systematically redistributed among ethnic Russians or Slavic populations brought in to replace them or handed over to the Red Army for military purposes, effectively erasing the historical presence of these communities from their homelands and making their return impossible even if permission were later granted. In addition to ethnic deportations, which affected over 1 million people, Beria reinforced control over Soviet prisoners of war who had been captured by German forces and subsequently liberated by advancing Red Army units. These soldiers, despite having fought for the Soviet Union and suffered in German captivity, were considered politically compromised and potentially contaminated by exposure to enemy propaganda, Western ideas, and knowledge of living standards outside the Soviet Union. They were systematically interrogated, using harsh methods designed to break their will, and many ended up again in the gulags accused of treason, cowardice, or collaboration, simply for having allowed themselves to be captured alive rather than fighting to the death. The NKVD created special camps specifically for repatriated ex-combatants, where surveillance was even stricter than in regular camps, where suspicion was institutionalized in regulations, and where former soldiers were subjected to intense political re-education designed to neutralize any ideological contamination. After the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, following years of devastating warfare that had killed tens of millions of Soviet citizens, Lavrentiy Beria received from Stalin the direct and personal responsibility of leading the development of the Soviet nuclear program, a mission considered of absolute maximum priority for Soviet security, international prestige, and the ability to compete with the United States. The project, officially designated as Project Number 2 to conceal its true nature, was carried out under absolute and uncompromising secrecy beyond the administrative reach of the Red Army, outside normal governmental channels, and under the direct supervision of the NKVD and later the MVD. Beria organized a massive parallel structure of research institutions, production facilities, logistics networks, and security systems that combined Soviet scientists whose loyalty had been thoroughly verified, captured German specialists with relevant expertise in nuclear physics and engineering, detailed intelligence reports obtained through extensive espionage networks in the West, and technical documentation stolen from the Manhattan Project through penetration of American nuclear facilities. One of the first crucial steps in the accelerated program was the creation of KB-11, the highly secret research center that would later evolve into the completely closed city of Sarov, where scientists worked in total isolation from the outside world, forbidden from leaving or maintaining contact with family members outside. Beria assigned essentially unlimited resources to the project, including scarce materials, personnel diverted from other priorities, funding that exceeded the budgets of some government ministries, and political support at the highest levels, diverting these resources from other sectors of the struggling post-war economy without hesitation or concern for civilian needs. To accelerate results and reduce costs, he ordered the extensive use of Gulag prisoners in dangerous tasks such as uranium mining without protective equipment or safety precautions, reactor construction with direct exposure to dangerous levels of radiation, and transport of hazardous materials. The necessary infrastructure for the nuclear program was erected in record time, following models and technical specifications obtained through Soviet espionage against the United States and the United Kingdom, supplemented by the forced labor of German scientists and the insights of Soviet physicists. In addition to managing the technical aspects of bomb development and coordinating the extensive espionage operations that penetrated Western nuclear programs, Beria intervened directly and personally in the internal organization of scientific teams working under extreme pressure. He demanded detailed weekly reports on progress, created evaluation committees that rigorously assessed progress and identified delays, and established strict hierarchies within research institutes that violated traditional academic norms, considerably reducing the traditional autonomy of scientists and subjecting them to political oversight and control. Despite this oppressive atmosphere of constant pressure, continuous surveillance, and the ever-present threat of arrest and execution for failure, key scientific figures such as Igor Kurchatov, Yuli Khariton, and Andrei Sakharov actively participated in the project with genuine scientific dedication and commitment, consciously aware of the strategic value that the atomic bomb represented for the geopolitical survival of the Soviet Union in an increasingly hostile international environment dominated by the United States. In August 1949, representing a triumph that stunned Western intelligence agencies, the Soviet Union successfully conducted its first nuclear test, officially known as RDS-1 or nicknamed Joe-1 in Western intelligence terminology, detonated at the Semipalatinsk test site in the remote steppes of Kazakhstan, far from population centers. The successful detonation, which occurred years earlier than American analysts had predicted was possible, was communicated to the Politburo with contained euphoria but enormous relief, and Beria personally received prestigious state awards, including the Hero of Socialist Labor, public recognition of his indispensable contribution, and a notable increase in political prestige that positioned him as an indispensable figure in Soviet leadership. Although he was not a scientist or engineer himself and lacked formal training in nuclear physics, he had demonstrated through his management of the nuclear program the ability to mobilize the entire machinery of the police state, coordinate extraordinarily complex technical projects involving thousands of personnel, manage competing priorities and scarce resources, and deliver results that exceeded initial expectations, ensuring that the strategic objective was met ahead of the established deadline and at a fraction of the cost that American intelligence had estimated would be necessary. At the beginning of the 1950s, as Stalin aged and his health declined visibly, Lavrentiy Beria consolidated his position as one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Union by assuming simultaneous control of multiple security agencies and thereby concentrating unprecedented power in a single individual outside Stalin himself. Under his direct supervision and administrative command were the MGB, which was the Ministry of State Security responsible for foreign intelligence and counterintelligence, the MVD, which was the reorganized successor to the NKVD, now called the Ministry of the Interior controlling domestic security and the prison system, and strategic sectors of the military apparatus including counterintelligence units within the armed forces. Passports and travel documents, confidential personnel files on millions of Soviet citizens, ongoing surveillance operations targeting thousands of individuals, labor camps holding hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and the extensive secret police apparatus were all under his unified command, creating a degree of centralized control over the instruments of repression that was extraordinary even by Soviet standards and unprecedented in Soviet history. During that critical period when everyone anticipated Stalin's death, he implemented a comprehensive policy of meticulous surveillance over the party leadership itself, demonstrating that even the highest officials were not immune to observation and that no one could feel completely secure. Local party authorities, military generals with distinguished service records, government ministers responsible for major sectors, industrial managers controlling important facilities, and even Politburo members who sat at the apex of power were systematically monitored through hidden microphones installed in offices and private residences by technical specialists. Infiltrated agents placed among their personal staff who reported conversations, and detailed psychological reports assessing their reliability, potential disloyalty, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The accumulated files, which eventually numbered in the millions of pages, were carefully archived under his personal supervision, organized for easy retrieval, and became a key tool of political pressure and blackmail in the face of the imminent succession crisis that everyone understood was approaching as Stalin aged, his health declined, and the question of succession became increasingly urgent. Beria also played an active and significant role in the repression of groups considered ideologically deviant, politically unreliable, or ethnically suspect. The anti-Zionist campaign, which became widely known as the Doctors' Plot, gained considerable strength and visibility during that period, resulting in the widespread detention and systematic persecution of Jewish doctors accused of conspiring to assassinate members of the Soviet leadership through deliberate medical sabotage and poisoning. Although the campaign was officially justified as a matter of national security and protecting state leaders from assassination, it was actually part of a broader movement of ethnic purge, state-sponsored anti-Semitic persecution, and control of the intellectual and professional elite whose loyalty was questioned. Although Beria participated in preparing the accusations, providing the security apparatus for arrests, and coordinating the investigation, he maintained some public distance from the most extreme aspects of the process, probably as a calculated political precautionary measure to avoid being too closely identified with policies that might later be reversed or criticized, and to maintain flexibility for his own future political positioning. In the administrative sphere, demonstrating his continued focus on economic exploitation, he further expanded the economic use of the vast prison system, directing labor camps toward increasingly ambitious industrial and scientific projects. The exploitation of labor in the gulags reached unprecedented levels, with forced labor deployed in uranium mines with high radiation exposure and minimal safety precautions, construction of secret military cities that appeared on no maps and whose existence was denied, development of heavy infrastructure, including massive canals and railways through hostile terrain, and extraction of natural resources in the most remote and inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union. The Ministry of the Interior, reorganized under his leadership and functioning with bureaucratic efficiency, operated as the logistical manager of entire sectors of the Soviet economy, controlling more resources, manpower, and industrial capacity than many government ministries, and making substantial contributions to Soviet industrial output through the systematic exploitation of unfree labor. The death of Joseph Stalin, which occurred on March 5, 1953, after days of declining health, possible stroke, and apparent medical neglect by doctors afraid to treat him, opened a dangerous power vacuum in the Soviet leadership and gave rise to a tense and silent dispute among his principal collaborators over who would dominate the post-Stalin government and shape Soviet policy. Beria, then Minister of the Interior, member of the inner circle of the Politburo, and controller of the vast security apparatus, emerged as a central figure in the transition and appeared to many observers both inside and outside the Soviet Union to be the most likely successor given his control of the instruments of coercion. In the new collective government formed immediately after the leader's death, he assumed the prominent position of Deputy Prime Minister, while simultaneously accumulating and consolidating control of all internal security forces, creating a concentration of power that alarmed other members of the leadership, who feared he would use the security services to eliminate them and establish a personal dictatorship. In the first days and weeks after Stalin's death, Beria surprised his colleagues and outside observers with an unexpected reformist turn that seemed to contradict his previous record of brutal repression and raised questions about his true intentions. He ordered the immediate suspension of the doctor's plot investigation, which had served as the legal basis for anti-Semitic persecutions and political arrests in the preceding months, releasing the accused doctors and acknowledging that the charges had been fabricated. In addition, he proposed a broad and unprecedented amnesty for prisoners of the Gulag system, which resulted in the release of approximately 1 million detainees, many of them accused of political crimes or sentenced for trivial offenses that reflected the excessive severity of Stalinist justice. This dramatic gesture generated both hope among the population and concern among party conservatives, who saw it as dangerously destabilizing and a repudiation of Stalin's legacy. Another of his strategic proposals was to re-establish diplomatic relations with Yugoslavia, which had been severed since Tito's expulsion from the Cominform in 1948 over issues of Soviet dominance and Tito's insistence on an independent path to socialism. This rapprochement aimed to reverse Soviet isolation in the Balkans, signal a more pragmatic and flexible international stance, reduce tensions that might lead to conflict, and potentially create a model for relations with other communist states that desired greater autonomy. At the internal level, he also advocated returning certain administrative prerogatives and cultural autonomy to non-Russian republics, especially in the Baltic countries that had been forcibly incorporated during World War II and the Caucasus, where nationalist sentiment remained strong and could potentially explode into violence. These proposals suggested a fundamental rethinking of Soviet nationalities policy and the rigid centralization that had characterized the Stalin era and provoked resentment among non-Russian populations. During those tense months of transition following Stalin's death, while he promoted reforms publicly, Beria maintained the repressive apparatus completely intact and functioning at full operational capacity, even while promoting a public discourse of reforms, liberalization, and moderation. The MVD, the new designation for the Ministry of the Interior, continued to operate with full technical capacity, maintaining extensive surveillance networks that monitored millions of citizens, controlling the vast prison system, and monitoring potential threats to the new regime. State agents closely monitored public reactions to his reform agenda, compiled detailed reports on popular sentiment in different regions, identified potential sources of opposition or instability, and assessed whether the reforms were generating dangerous expectations. The combination of continued police control, extensive intelligence networks penetrating all levels of society, strategic intelligence gathering, and reformist rhetoric created a deeply volatile scenario in which Beria's true intentions remained unclear. This ambiguity generated profound suspicion among other leaders, who wondered whether the reforms were genuine expressions of a new political philosophy or merely tactical maneuvers to consolidate power and build popular support that could be used against rivals. On June 26, 1953, during what appeared to be a routine meeting of the Presidium in the heavily guarded Kremlin, Lavrentiy Beria was suddenly confronted with a formal accusation of treason, carefully articulated by Nikita Khrushchev, with the decisive and previously secured support of the Minister of Defense, the prestigious Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the loyalty of the armed forces and whose participation was essential to the success of the operation. Without any prior warning or indication that anything unusual would occur at the meeting, armed military personnel under Zhukov's direct command surrounded the meeting room and arrested Beria at that very moment, under the official justification that he was actively planning a coup d'état against the collective leadership using his control of the security services. The operation had been carefully rehearsed in secret meetings in the days immediately preceding the arrest, and Khrushchev had obtained silent but firm guarantees of support from key military commanders and from other Politburo members who feared Beria's power to act with overwhelming speed and force before Beria could activate his extensive security networks or mobilize loyal NKVD units. Immediately after the dramatic arrest, which occurred without resistance from Beria, who seemed stunned by the betrayal, Beria was transferred to a secret military location under tight army custody, completely isolated from his former extensive network of agents, collaborators, and subordinates who might have attempted a rescue or counter-coup if they had known of his arrest. The government initiated an intensive official campaign through all state-controlled media, to systematically discredit him and justify his removal, publicly accusing him of being a long-term British spy who had betrayed Soviet interests for decades, an enemy of the people who had committed innumerable crimes against Soviet citizens, and a revisionist conspirator who sought to undermine communist principles and restore capitalism. State-controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official announcements began to spread shocking revelations about his alleged moral deviations, including sexual crimes, extensive administrative corruption and theft of state property, criminal sexual conduct against numerous women, and elaborate plans to sabotage Soviet unity and restore capitalism through his reforms. In the weeks following his arrest, while Beria remained in isolation, a special investigative team was formed to conduct the investigation and prepare his trial in complete and absolute secrecy without any public scrutiny or international observation. No civil court was convened, no public hearing was scheduled, and no independent observers were permitted to attend. The case was handled exclusively by a military tribunal subordinate to the new leadership, and composed of judges who had clear political incentives to ensure conviction and who understood that their careers depended on the outcome. Testimonies were collected in a directed manner with leading questions, with investigators prioritizing statements that presented Beria as a manipulative, duplicitous, and dangerous figure who had deceived the party for decades. Witnesses who might have offered exculpatory testimony were not called, and documents that might have complicated the prosecution narrative or revealed the complicity of other leaders were excluded from the proceedings. The trial officially began in December and lasted only a few days, far too brief for a case of such supposed complexity, historical importance, and the volume of alleged crimes spanning decades. Beria was prohibited from exercising a complete defense, denied access to legal counsel of his choosing, and not granted access to the official documentation of the investigative process or the evidence allegedly collected against him. He was convicted of multiple serious charges, including espionage for foreign powers, conspiracy against the Soviet state, abuse of power for personal gain and sexual gratification, and numerous crimes against the Soviet people, all classified as high treason punishable by death. Among the judges who pronounced the verdict were military generals who had benefited politically from his downfall, whose careers would be enhanced by their participation, and who owed their positions to the new leadership. The verdict was read in a closed session with no observers or media present, and the sentence of death was executed that same day without any possibility of appeal, review, or clemency. On December 23, 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was executed by firing squad after the secret trial conducted by a military tribunal, specially and specifically constituted for that singular purpose. The death sentence was executed on the same day it was pronounced, without any prior public announcement to Soviet society, without notification to foreign governments or international organizations, and without the procedural delays that normally characterized even political trials in the Soviet system. The exact place of execution remains officially unknown and classified to this day, and there was no ceremony, no public grave marker allowing for commemoration, no accessible official record for historians or family members, and no public acknowledgement of where his remains were disposed or whether they were cremated. His physical elimination was accompanied by a systematic and comprehensive erasure operation conducted across the entire Soviet Union with thoroughness. Official portraits were removed from government buildings and public spaces. His name was deleted from documents in internal circulation. References to his achievements, including his role in the nuclear program, were eliminated from official histories. Photographs were altered to remove his image from group settings, and associates who had worked with him faced interrogation about their connections. Despite the official silence, deliberate obscurity, and systematic attempts at historical erasure, Beria's legacy survived as a persistent and troubling shadow in the Soviet political imagination and administrative reality that could not be entirely eliminated. The security model he designed and perfected over decades, characterized by constant surveillance of the population, meticulous document control and record-keeping, systematic repression organized bureaucratically, and the strategic use of fear as a fundamental tool of governance, continued functioning with remarkable consistency throughout the entire post-Stalin era and even into the final years of the Soviet Union. Although generally maintained with somewhat less intensity, fewer mass killings, and more sophisticated methods, the core principles of control remained intact. The administrative machinery of fear and control did not disappear with his death or become obsolete with changing political circumstances. It was simply readjusted, recalibrated for new political conditions, and transferred to new management while retaining its essential characteristics, operational methods, and institutional culture. Beria left behind detailed operational protocols refined over years of practice, proven investigative methods that were documented in training materials, organizational structures that functioned efficiently and could be replicated, surveillance techniques that remained effective as technology advanced, and administrative systems that could operate effectively without his direct personal presence or supervision. The massive files he had accumulated over decades, containing compromising information on millions of Soviet citizens, were reorganized after his fall, recategorized for the new leadership's purposes, and continued to serve as the foundation for ongoing surveillance, political control, and coercion in the years and decades following his execution. The infrastructure of repression he had built, including extensive networks of informants penetrating all levels of society, systems for monitoring communications, established procedures for identifying dissent, and proven methods for suppressing opposition, remained in place and continued to function under new directors who had learned their craft under his supervision or had studied his methods. Lavrentiy Beria was executed and systematically erased from official records. His name became unmentionable in polite Soviet society and dangerous to reference, and his image was literally cut out of historical photographs. But the comprehensive system he helped design, the refine and perfect, continued functioning with bureaucratic efficiency for decades. It operated silently without public acknowledgement or documentation, maintained discipline through fear and comprehensive surveillance, and remained utterly relentless in identifying and neutralizing potential threats to state power. For decades after his death, extending through the Khrushchev era, the Brezhnev period, and into the final years of Soviet power, his name was carefully avoided in public speeches and official histories. However, his architecture of control, his methods of surveillance, and his systems of repression remained alive and operational in the gears of the Soviet state apparatus, influencing the lives of millions of citizens who never knew his name or understood how the systems controlling their lives had originated. At the end of this comprehensive examination, an uncomfortable question remains that historians, political scientists, and students of totalitarianism continue to debate without reaching consensus. Was the real danger posed by Beria himself as an individual, a uniquely evil man whose personal depravity, moral corruption, and naked ambition drove Soviet repression to new extremes? Or was the greater and more fundamental danger the system itself that allowed and encouraged, and indeed required someone like him to rise so far, accumulate so much unchecked power, and implement such comprehensive mechanisms of control? Was Beria an historical aberration, an exceptionally evil individual who corrupted an otherwise legitimate system? Or was he a logical product of totalitarian governance structures that inevitably produce such figures and reward precisely the characteristics he displayed? And you, what is your considered assessment based on this evidence? Was Beria merely a loyal instrument of Stalin, who faithfully executed the dictator's will without independent agency? Or was he an independent conspirator who harbored his own distinct ambitions for absolute power and who might have ruled differently, perhaps even more brutally, or perhaps with genuine reforms? Had he succeeded in the succession struggle? What does his remarkable career teach us about the nature of totalitarian systems, the psychology of those who serve them, the mechanisms by which such systems maintain control over populations, and the warning signs that appear before such systems consolidate power? How do we recognize similar patterns emerging in contemporary political systems, and what can be done to prevent the concentration of power that enables figures like Beria to emerge? Leave us your considered opinion in the comments, because this debate still actively divides scholars, politicians, political scientists, and historians around the world, with fundamentally different interpretations of his role, his significance, and the lessons his life offers for understanding authoritarianism. If you found substantial value in this comprehensive journey through Soviet history and the mechanisms of totalitarian power, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to ensure you receive future content examining similar historical figures and political systems. In upcoming videos, we will continue revealing the hidden secrets of power, the mechanisms of authoritarian control, the historical patterns that repeat across different cultures and time periods, and the connections between past and present that many institutions and governments still prefer to keep obscured or misunderstood. If you choose not to subscribe, I tell you with complete seriousness and without exaggeration, you will miss carefully researched content, deeply analyzed historical material, connections between past and present, and insights into power structures that virtually no one else presents with this level of depth, nuance, documentary evidence, and scholarly rigor.